Hello and welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thanks so much for joining me on the show again. This week, we're talking about law enforcement. You know, there's a really weird thing about law enforcement in America. We have a structure that almost no other country does. In many parts of this country, you'll have a police department, the leader of which is appointed by the mayor, right? But then you will separately also have a sheriff's department, which does basically the same thing, except that the sheriff is an elected official who's accountable to no one but himself or herself, but really mostly himself. That's strange, right? It's strange that we have two departments that are structured differently that do basically the same thing. Why is that? Also consider this, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department is famous for being the largest sheriff's department in the country, but it's also famous for its rich tradition of scandal, corruption, and violence. One recent sheriff, Lee Baca, was convicted of trying to cover up the rampant and horrific abuse in LA County jails. And after 16 years in office, he left in disgrace and was eventually sentenced to 6 months in prison. Well, so this is an elected office, right? So the people get a say. And in 2018, the people of Los Angeles elected a new sheriff, Alex Villanueva, on a platform of cleaning up the sheriff's department. Surely this time things would be different, right? Unfortunately not. Villanueva added jet fuel to the trash fire at the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. He was involved in a cover-up of inmate mistreatment, he incessantly attacked the press, and he even raided the home of an LA County supervisor who was a critic of the department, literally using his law enforcement powers to try to silence another elected official who was exercising their valid oversight function. That's fucking insane. The LA Times called Villanueva a loose, dangerous, misfiring cannon aimed at his perceived enemies. And if all that sounds like Villanueva was acting more like, I don't know, a gang boss than an elected official, well, you're goddamn right. Because for decades, the LA Sheriff's Department has been rife with literal criminal gangs. Groups of deputies in the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, law enforcement officers, have formed gangs with their own initiations, tattoos, often based on their race. They're known for their dumb names like the Bandidos, the Compton Executioners, and the Linwood Vikings, but more importantly, they are known for abuse, corruption, and murder. They basically operate as an extra-legal shadow government within law enforcement, enforcing their own twisted rules of how the sheriff's department should operate, completely separate from what the public might want or need. I mean, this is just fucking bonkers. It's not the sort of thing that you think should exist in a country like America, where we respect the rule of law, where we have a democracy that is supposed to serve all of the people, right? And yet it does, not just in Los Angeles, but in sheriff's departments across the country. It just seems as though there is something special about sheriff's departments and the people who lead them that cause them to be more violent, more abusive, and more corrupt than normal police, which already have plenty of their own problems. So what is it about sheriffs that make them such a pernicious force in America today? Are they just cops in cowboy hats, or are they something much worse? Well, on the show today, we have an incredible guest who is going to answer that question for us. But before we get into it, I just want to remind you, if you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon. $5 a month gets you every episode of this show ad-free. Don't forget to watch my new stand-up special, Unmedicated, out now at dropout.tv. Use the code ADAM33 for 33% off your first year subscription. And if you like stand-up comedy, come see me on the road. I'm doing my brand new hour of stand-up. If you have seen me on the road before, you have not seen this material. Come out. Coming up soon, I'm headed to Austin, Texas, Batavian, Illinois, San Francisco, California, Toronto, Ontario, Chicago, Boston, and East Providence, Rhode Island, all places that have their own sheriffs who I hope are not going to bust my head when I show up in that city to perform stand-up comedy. Head to adamconover.net for all those tickets and tour dates. And now, let's get to this week's episode. Here today to talk about the dire problem that sheriffs pose to American society and democracy, my guest is Jessica Pishko. She's a journalist, a lawyer, and the author of the new book, The Highest Law in the Land: How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Please welcome Jessica Pishko. Jessica, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Happy to be here.
So I just want to start, first of all, I often don't think about the fact that in the city where I live, Los Angeles, we have two kinds of law enforcement. We have a police department and we have a sheriff's department, which do basically the same thing, only one is elected and one is not. And that's true for many, many jurisdictions around America. Why the hell is that the case, first of all? Like, what is the point of having two law enforcement, like top law enforcement officials, one of whom is appointed, one of whom is elected?
So sheriffs would say that they came first. That's their claim to fame. The sheriff came from England, where it was called the Shire Reeve. So this is your sheriff of Nottingham who went to
Yes.
town, collected taxes. Nobody liked him, right?
Yeah.
Delivered the
He was
orders of the
so
king.
he was so mean to all those animals in the Disney movie.
He really was. He was a bad guy. And
Yeah.
the story became that when white people came to the United States, started forming the colonies. Over time, the United States, when it was young, was very proud of being a democracy. And so they thought, oh, we want to make all these offices democratically elected. There really
Mm.
were no city police. There were very few cities. There were sometimes slave catchers or posses, but they just didn't have formal police, which is hard to picture because we have so many law enforcement today. And when Andrew Jackson became president, so this is the 1830s, he had this idea that he would make all local offices, including sheriffs, should be elected. So there was this great wave of electing everybody. This is how we got like elected county boards and elected school boards and sheriffs and all sorts of stuff. And then this idea, as the United States began to acquire more territory to the west, went with it. Now, it was also a time when there was a lot of war. There were a lot of wars against Native Americans. Native Americans were being moved westward to different
Right.
places. And we also were fighting the Mexicans, right? We were taking over parts of what was Mexico. And so as a result, there were a lot of mostly men going west who were sort of like decommissioned military. They had a very militia style a way of thinking, and those guys basically became sheriffs and or members of sheriff's posses. So in California, they would call their law enforcement the Vigilance Committee, which was just
Hmm.
top dudes met in the saloon, sit around with the sheriff and say, "Hey, I think we ought to go. This guy is really causing us a problem. I think we need to get a posse, go after him."
This is like straight out of a Wild West movie.
It is. That's the Wild West
It's
style.
literally true.
It is, and it's
Except probably sometimes they're just roughing up somebody they didn't like or somebody who they didn't like the looks of, I would guess.
yes. So most of the time, right, the people that they were fighting. So you were thinking they're fighting Native Americans. They're fighting a lot of people who are Mexican because, of course, it was Mexico. So people who were Mexican were living in that part of the United States. Over time, it became a huge problem. They didn't like what we would call houseless people, what they called
Mhm.
hobos. So people
Mhm.
would go westward. They didn't have homes. They were a bunch of single men who had set up encampments outside of Los Angeles and San Francisco in particular. And the sort of men in charge, the posses did not like that. So they would send like posses out regularly to kind of make sure these guys outside of town were not causing trouble.
How did we get the modern sheriff of today? Like the guy with the, badge and the, I picture in my head the modern sheriff. How did we get to that?
So over time, policing changed a lot, right? Like people got guns, we got judges and courts, and sheriffs began to use their jail more. So the other thing sheriffs do is run the jail, which in a place
Mm.
like Los Angeles is what, 30,000 people. So
Yeah.
it's like a small city. Some places it's real small, maybe a dozen people. And keeping people in the jail was one of the sheriff's main jobs, and it was fee for service. So let's say sometimes this would happen. Maybe there was an enslaved person who was captured. They would take that person to the sheriff and say, "Sheriff, you're in charge. Hold this individual until their enslaver picks them up." When the enslaver picked them up, they would pay the sheriff a fee, like, "Thank you very much." Or if they were never picked up, the sheriff would sell that person at an auction and keep the proceeds.
You're describing like a tow truck yard for people.
Yes, it really
This is
was.
like we're going to impound your enslaved person,
Yes.
and you can pick them up later and you'll have to pay us a fee.
Yes, that's exactly what it was like. I mean, it really
Wow.
was like the people were objects, and sheriffs were
Yeah.
motivated to keep people alive because they wanted their fee, right? So if you
Wow.
don't deliver the person in, original condition, you would not get your full
God.
fee.
Oh my
I
God.
mean, it's a horrible
There's a
thing.
dent. There's a dent on this guy that wasn't there before. I'm sorry. This is like very dark humor. Please keep going.
Oh, it is very dark, right? And then after the Civil War, Reconstruction, sheriffs began to use the people in their jail. They leased them out. So this was called convict leasing, which a lot of people might have heard about. They
Uh-huh.
they basically lease the people in their jail out to labor, so to factories or farms, mines, uh, getting tar in the Everglades, which always stuck in my head because it was particularly miserable
As
to
a task.
to be in
And,
the Everglades.
and there's been stories about that happening today. I mean, there's prisoners. I forget if it was Alabama, which state it was, these are folks in prison, not in a jail, but who are being leased out to McDonald's to work at McDonald's. Then when their shift is over, they go back to prison. More Perfect Union just did a big investigative report on this. But so as police become professionalized and modernized, the sheriffs do as well. And they just keep hanging around in these jurisdictions.
They do. They just keep hanging around in these jurisdictions. Now, you have to think about the fact that 80% of the counties in the United States are rural or mostly rural. That's a lot of counties. So that means even though most people, so like as generally speaking, 80% of people live in like 20% of the counties. That's like kind of a rough shorthand. So most people are moving to cities and living in cities. And I don't want to say like city police didn't have their issues, right? It's not like they have their own sort of story, but sheriffs continue to have a lot of power, particularly in these like large swaths of places where there were fewer people. And in certain places, sheriffs had a lot of power in the South and the West in particular. Some cities in the Northeast have other types of law enforcement. They have like a constabulary, which is something more like a night watchman. So they, like other places in the Northeast, had slightly different kinds of law enforcement, which is why you hear all about it. But yeah, the sheriffs remain. And a lot of it, honestly, is because they run jails. So 85% of jails in the country are run by an elected sheriff. That is at this
Got it.
point the bulk of what they do. But they do a lot of policing, especially in places, again, that are more rural or suburban. In the case of Los Angeles County, of course, it's a bit different because the Los Angeles department is so large and they have so many cities that they police, right? So they
Yeah.
basically cities, when they couldn't afford a police department, which is still true in a lot of places, like places in Louisiana, places in the West, like sheriffs also do a lot of this work, again, fee for service. So basically you pay the sheriff to be your police. You say, okay, here's what you get, like one guy in a car for X. I mean, they actually pay like per guy in a car.
Well, and it's the recurring theme of fee for service is really interesting, that you've got people paying the sheriff historically to sort of impound people. And then you've got cities paying the sheriff's department, hey, we can't afford our own, but we can contract it out to the county that we're a part of. But it's almost like, that's literally sort of what a militia is, like an armed group that you can contract with or not. That's a very strange state of affairs. But also the fact that this is an elected position is very strange, because I think, often think of law enforcement as being accountable to the civilian government, right? To use a military analogy, to a mayor or to a governor or et cetera. But that's not really the case with elected sheriffs, is it? So what's the problem with the sheriff's role being elected?
So the main problem with it, I mean, look, it depends on what you think is a problem, I guess. Sheriffs don't think it's a problem. They think it's great because
Of course.
so they could claim, they claim legitimacy because they're elected. So they say, well, I was elected, and so what I do is what the people elected me to do. And if they don't like it, they can just vote me out, right? It's a great way to kind of pass the buck and say, like, I'm just doing what the people said they wanted. I mean, the issue with it, as you rightly point out, is one, elections are only every 4 years. And two, I think people don't quite know what the sheriffs are doing, like what you're voting for. And that's because a lot of what sheriffs do, to be quite honest, is not something that people see. So, like, if the sheriff is serving people, those little gross meat pies for meals, like the mystery meat lobs. People might not know that because maybe they haven't been in jail or don't have loved ones in jail. And the people who do know that might be people who have been in jail. And those are not people that get a lot of attention, right? People might not listen. So, like, I don't think people are thinking about the fact that that's what they're voting for. The other issue is, of course, if a sheriff decides to like go off the rails, and we see this now, right? The sheriffs are increasingly political. Like the politics on the national level is trickling down. So folks aren't really voting for sheriff based on like, I like this guy. He seems like a good dude. He goes to my church, whatever. They're voting for it because, he supports Trump or he does not support Trump. So
Right.
it's sort of creating the situation with like their highly politicized figures who will say, this is whatever Biden's border policy. It's the fault of Joe Biden, and that's why we have immigration or something like that. So
Yes.
that's a big
Well,
problem.
the police in general have become politicized. And even here in
Yes.
Los Angeles, the LAPD will do things that, have political power to them. The officers will go to neighborhood meetings and say, oh, your local elected official is too tough on homelessness, and that's why there's a problem. So you need to get someone new in. I've been in meetings where I've heard this happen. You also have police, doing basically taking labor actions without announcing that's what it is in order to try to get more money for the police department, et cetera. But that's a little bit of, those are more subtle political activities. When you're talking about the sheriffs, there's a much bigger difference. I mean, Alex Villanueva, who was the sheriff of Los Angeles, I'm sure you're very familiar with him, as he's one of the most egregious examples of an abusive sheriff, I think, in America. You probably know some that are even worse, but this is the one where I live. This man was just objectively corrupt, but could not be removed by the county supervisors who, are the people who supervise the entire county of Los Angeles. If the chief of police was that corrupt, well, the mayor could just kick him out. But when the sheriff is that corrupt, there's nothing that can be done until he serves out his term. A, that's one problem. And B, the guy was going on Tucker Carlson like every night,
Yes.
going like, this is Joe Biden's fault or whatever. And, like running as though he was a Republican congressman or something like that. And I think we've all learned to accept that when we're talking about the legislature or even a governor or the president, that there's those partisan differences. But I think that most people feel that law enforcement shouldn't be a partisan state of affairs, right? That it should be something a little bit more dispassionate. I don't know.
Well, it does seem, I was going to say Alex Villanueva I know well because he gave my book a not rave review. He was
your book critiquing the office of sheriff, the one of the most power mad sheriffs in America, didn't like the book. Where did he write this review?
He said it, he still does an Instagram live. He still thinks he's running for office. So he held it up and said that I quote trash him and every other sheriff known to man. And that's
I mean, that's a pretty good advertisement. You should put that on the cover.
I was good. I was impressed he read it. I had a feeling he was one of those guys who looked at the index for his name. So, he's like, where am I? Where am I? Where am I?
That's what I do. I'm a name searcher too. I search my own name. People know. But yeah, I get that. I mean, yeah, he was kicked out of office. We have a new sheriff now, but he was not reelected. But yes, he continually has almost been like running. He's very much like Trump in that he refuses to accept defeat electorally. He's just like always continuing to be at it and like speaking to his constituents.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, what do you write about his special case in the book? Or are there even worse examples of abuse by sheriffs?
Well, I don't want to say sheriffs are worse or better, but what he did was really common. Now, the reason why Alex Villanueva, I think, was more noticeable is that one, Los Angeles is big, and two, Los Angeles is diverse, right? Like you have a lot of people who are more liberal leaning. And they look at that and they say, that's not cool. Like you can't create a special task force and arrest, people who criticize you, right? That's something he did. And that's why I think it's more pernicious in a way because all the things he did are things that sheriffs are doing, but they're not as getting either as much attention or pushback. So, like, all the tactics are the same. So, for example, just refusing to do what people say, do this. You can't hire this guy. This guy was no good. Well, whatever. I'm going to do it. What are you going to do about it? Right? People kind of shrug and they're like, they sort of don't always know how to handle it, I think. And more, which is like what sheriffs do, is they use the fact that they're police to harass their opponents. So it is unfortunately relatively common to do things like look up numbers of ex-girlfriends and harass them, harass,
Wow.
politicians they don't like, harass people at the county commission they don't like. And, beyond that, I think it's the abuses of the people either that they're policing or that they have in their jail too. That's,
Mm-hmm.
Alex Oldwave maybe didn't do it directly, but I think we all saw that his deputies who were forming gangs, felt emboldened and entitled to go around. I mean, they shot people. They were beating people up in jail, right?
Yes.
He had kind of just like a attitude of, well, you guys could go do whatever. I'm on your side. I'm not going to do anything about it.
And because they're elected, sheriffs have a lot more impunity. Like, again, if you're the chief of police, well, you do have to answer to the mayor, at least. You have a lot more impunity than most appointed officials because, you're seen as the head of law enforcement and you probably have a commanding position within the police unions, which are politically powerful, et cetera. But at the very least, you have a boss. But the sheriff literally does not have a boss. Like, nobody can tell the sheriff what to do because they're sort of the top of their own pyramid, right? And so it makes it rife for abuse like that. Like if someone says, like you say, this sheriff, this deputy abused a lot of people, they should not be hired back. The sheriff can do it and no one can tell them not to. No one can investigate. No one can, there's some oversight powers by other electeds, but nobody can say, hey, you're fired, right? And that's
Right.
maybe a problem.
No one can say, hey, you're fired. And I would say, like, look, there are things that sheriffs do. Like, some of this stuff is not legal, but the problem is that they generally get a lot of leeway, right? Like, people give them a really long leash to do whatever they want. Now, all that stuff, like going at Tucker Carlson or all these sheriffs who appear on Fox or Newsmax, that's all legal, right? This is the legal stuff. And the other problem is, in general, being kind of an excessively violent police also not really illegal, right? That's a legal thing. Now, of course, you had Baca, who did have to go to jail, right? So he did enough.
The preceding sheriff,
right? The preceding sheriff
was so corrupt and doing so many illegal things and abusing people. He actually went to jail. Villanueva was the guy who was elected by. I voted for the guy. People elected him because we all thought that he'd clean the place up. He was the new guy. He was the outsider, and he was worse by many measures. But yes, so they can do enough things where they can eventually go to prison themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. Like if you look at someone like Joe Arpaio, I mean, Joe Arpaio did, right? He got sued by the Department of Justice. He was supposed to go to prison until he got pardoned. So, I mean, like, there are instances in which some of these sheriffs do get in trouble. I mean, the problem is, of course, like, one, everyone knows it's always hard to prosecute police generally. And it's sort of extra hard when it's a sheriff. And again, all this political activity, like saying, even lying, during COVID, we had a lot of sheriffs who refused to enforce COVID rules. They didn't want to close businesses. They would spread like rumors about vaccines. So there were some sheriffs who would just post like random things about like vaccines or their opinions about, COVID, that's all perfectly legal. Like they're allowed to post their opinion, extremely well-versed opinions about health and vaccines.
Sure. Yeah. Folks, let's face it. The last few years of U.S. politics have been nothing short of explosive. In this polarized political climate following the election, it's downright unsettling to know that your personally identifiable information, like your name, phone number, home address, and even the names of your family members, is likely being collected, shared, and sold by data brokers online. This information, easily accessible to just about anyone, can make you feel vulnerable, And frankly, there has never been a better time for a service like Delete Me. Look, here's the reality. According to Delete Me, 3 out of 4 voters now fear political violence. And one of the biggest enablers of personalized political attacks is the massive amount of personal data floating around on the web. Their research reveals that between 2019 and 2023, the volume of personal data online tripled in just 4 years, with an average of over 525 pieces of information per person available for free or for as little as $5 per profile for anyone who wants to purchase it. Think about it. There is no reason why this deeply personal information should be accessible to someone who might not have your best interests at heart, and that is where Delete Me steps in. When you sign up, their team of experts works tirelessly to scrub your personal data from data broker sites, reducing your risk and helping you reclaim your privacy. I have used it myself for many years before they even started advertising on this show. I can verify that it works. And in an era where tensions are high and personal safety feels increasingly precarious, Delete Me is here to help you protect what matters most. And get this, you can get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Adam and use promo code Adam at checkout. Delete Me international plans, go to http://international.joindeleteme.com. Use promo code Adam at checkout. Folks, are you looking to make your holiday hangout with friends extra special this year? Do you want to give them something more thoughtful than just another bottle of booze, huh? Well, Skylight Frame has got you covered. It's a touchscreen digital photo frame that is so easy to use, your whole crew and probably their parents are going to fall in love with it. Here's how it works. After a quick 60-second setup, you can upload thousands of photos straight from your phone, and voila, they will show up on the frame in seconds. You can keep sending new photos anytime from anywhere with just a quick tap on the free Skylight mobile app. Seriously, it is like having a constant highlight reel of your favorite memories delivered directly to the frame. And it's not just functional, it looks amazing too. With 5 frame styles to choose from and HD photo resolution, it is a classy addition to any home. Plus, you can set it up in portrait or landscape mode, so it is always picture perfect. So if you are ready to wow your friends and keep the holiday spirit alive all year, Skylight Frame is the gift they will never forget. And now, as a special limited time offer for our listeners, get $20 off your purchase of a Skylight Frame when you go to skylightframe.com/factually. That's skylightframe.com/factually. Get $20 off your purchase now at skylightframe.com/factually. You mentioned the deputy gangs. This is a big problem, again, here in Los Angeles, I know in other parts of the country as well, where at least here for many, many decades, there have been just straight up criminal gangs in the LA Sheriff's Department. We're talking about an entire station will be run by, or sheriff's, whatever, headquarters, a particular region, will be run by a gang that has a name. They have induction ceremonies. They have tattoos that they give each other. Some of them receive special tattoos when they kill members of the public for the first time. And those gangs, they intimidate people. I mean, you know more than me. I'm just trying to set the table here. It's like shocking when you read about it. Now, there's plenty of abuse in the regular police departments as well, but what is it about sheriff's deputies that cause them to form these gangs and behave differently from other police?
I do think that there's a trend by which I would say, one, sheriffs themselves tend to be more corrupt than police, like just in terms of taking money, some have done things like badges for donations. They'll sell off like auxiliary deputy badges and stuff. Sheriffs have a lot more control over what they do in their office. So if they want to have a posse, they can have a posse if they feel like it. No one can stop them. And same in most places, sheriffs get to hire and fire their deputies. Now, it's not true in California because you do have deputy unions. But what we did see was, right, Alex Villanueva could hire his loyal friends back. And that's something a lot of sheriffs do, right? They hire in smaller places, they hire their cousins, their brother-in-law, whatever, that guy that nobody else likes. They hire them and put them in their office and say, all right, you're my deputy now. And you could do what I say because they have that power and they get to pick, who's my second in command, who's going to run this, who's going to be in charge of this thing. I mean, and some of the people they pick are, yeah, it could be pretty wild. I mean, even
Yeah.
again, Alice Villanueva, a big department. I mean, he hired back a guy who had been fired for domestic abuse. I mean, he was not fit. It was plain he was not fit. But this is relatively common. They don't have to check backgrounds if they don't feel like it. A lot of them say that, oh, I don't have time, I'm busy, whatever. So that kind of creates in smaller departments, kind of like a mini gang. The New York Times reported on a sheriff's department in Mississippi where they had basically a gang that they called themselves the Goon Squad. They went around abusing people and, they texted each other. They were very proud of it. And, I think two things happen. One is that unfortunately, people who don't go along with a program, if they're smart, they leave. Because why wouldn't you, right? If you're in a place where it's being run by a deputy gang, you leave. I think
you wouldn't fight the deputy gang. That would be like a death sentence. You'd be like, this is horrible. The best thing I can do is get the fuck out of here and maybe tell somebody after I leave what the hell's going on in there.
Yeah, it's genuinely scary because they will. I mean, they could be real bullies. I mean, they'll do stuff. I mean, just the most.
They could beat the shit out of you. They have guns. Like they can kill with impunity. You're talking. I just want to be really clear what we're talking about. We're talking about a gang like any other gang, except this gang is people with badges who don't go to jail or prison when they commit any kind of crime. There's the country is rife with stories of police killing people who they shouldn't, being corrupt. We all know cops are never prosecuted. And this is a group of them. You're talking like a couple dozen people who are like, when they come up to you and they say, if you talk, we will murder you. You know that they will do it and they will never be punished because they're the fucking cops. Like, it's the most, I'm sorry, I'm tripping out on it a little bit. It's like one of the most obviously egregiously corrupt practices in American government today is these deputy gangs. And they have been almost impossible to root out. I mean, succession after succession of sheriff has been unable to get rid of them. They just say, oh, we're working on this problem of getting rid of the cliques. They won't even call them gangs. They'll call them cliques. And so, like, what is it that makes it impossible, seemingly, for our city governments to get rid of these things? Because it was one of those things that makes you go, is America not a civilized society that we have corrupt gangs, like, running our law enforcement? It's insane.
I'm not always clear that we are a civilized society sometimes. But,
fair enough.
But I do look in LA. I think the particular problem is that LA is far. Like if you're in Antelope Valley, you're really far from like the main LASD headquarters. And so why wouldn't they can just do that's what happens, right? They go out there, they just do what they want. And who's going to tell them not to, right? They don't have you would have to send mean principal over to tell them to stop. They're not going to stop. And who's motivated to do it also? If you are law enforcement, if you break up the gangs, what will happen is one, they'll all hate you and they'll just be like, we're going to vote this guy out. I mean, they will you cannot underestimate the power of deputies and their supporters to vote out sheriffs. When in a lot of places when people get sick of their sheriff, it's the deputies who are like, I don't like this guy. He's not letting us do gang stuff. He's going to go.
And so they just do their own political campaign and everyone listens to them because they're the deputies or the deputy union. And they say, we're supporting this person and that person, that we're supporting Mr. Gang Guy for sheriff. And everybody votes for that person. Of course, they never say that out loud, but that's what they're really doing. And that's who Alex Villanueva was. He was like Mr. Deputy. There was a really funny New Yorker article about him that basically portrayed him as he was the guy who wasn't really allowed to join the gang. He was like the low guy on the totem pole. Everyone was like, oh, this guy's kind of a punk. So he ends up running for sheriff later because he wants to impress all the guys who he wanted to be in the gang with. And they're like, okay, well now we'll let him in because he'll be like our guy at the top or whatever. That's basically his personality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He wasn't the cool dude. He was the guy no one liked that much. And then he became sheriff and then what did he do? He wanted to be popular. So he's like, yeah, y'all do what you want. I'm not gonna, I just got a tough guy around and it looks good. I mean, another Southern California sheriff similar is Chad Bianco in Riverside. who I don't know
Mhm.
if you've heard about him. He's the Oath Keeper one. He
Oh.
didn't win. He ran and lost, but then the deputies in the deputy union decided they were sick of the sheriff. They're like, okay, we're going to go with Chad Bianco. You're going to be our guy. And then he won. And then, when sheriffs win, they do stuff like they get people new uniforms, new cars, new guy, like, hey, I'm going to get you new stuff. It'll be cool.
It's like a patronage position. Like this, I mean, this literally sounds like 19th century shit. It sounds like when you hear about stories about like fire departments in New York, how they used to like get into fights over who could put the fire out, because or like the Tammany Hall days where it's like someone gets elected and they buy everybody new cars. This is it's such incredible corruption. We're talking about abuse of the public, abuse of inmates, often sexual abuse of inmates. We're talking about bribery and graft. We're talking about literal gangs that are violent in our law enforcement. You say that who is going to do it? Nobody really wants to deal with the problem. I want to deal with the problem. I don't have the power to, but I would go to the Antelope Valley, or I would try to put together some kind of government committee to do so, right? But this problem, like, there are a lot of people who want to solve this problem, and yet it seems to be intractable. I understand we don't have sort of the political will at the moment, but it's a little bit baffling to me. I mean, even in every time we have a sheriff's election here in LA, the people who care about this end up saying, well, my God, there's two candidates for sheriff and both of them suck because they're both former deputies, which means were formerly in gangs.
That's I would vote for you for sheriff, Adam. So if you run, I say you go ahead and run and we'll see. I mean, look, what I was, when I was reporting the book, I was like, what do I do? And I talked to someone and they're like, well, you could just fire everyone who's in a gang. They haven't done that yet. And I was like, well, that's a good point. Maybe they should just try that. So a simple method might be to fire everyone who's in a gang.
But to do that, you would need a sheriff who didn't want to keep the gangs around, which so far all of them do.
That's so, I mean, as I said, they want to keep power and it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't, you normally say to be fair when it comes to sheriffs, but to be fair, when you're elected sheriff, you go into an office, like all the deputies are looking at you like, I don't know about this guy, especially if you're elected as like a reform minded sheriff. You go in, they're like, I don't like this dude. I'm going to, throw away some paper. I mean, there are sheriffs who literally do this. They'll trash the office, throw stuff away, trash the evidence room. They're like, have fun, doing this, or they don't do their paperwork right. It kind of feels like, the sheriff is the boss, but if you have a lot of deputies who hate you, I can understand that it doesn't feel like you're the boss. Now, what I would say is you signed up to be sheriff.
Yeah.
You ran for office, so like I think you should know what you're getting into. I mean, look, I am a person who says we shouldn't even have these sheriff's offices. So
right.
Someone asked me how to reform. I forgot. Someone asked me at one point how to reform the LA Sheriff's Department, and I said, well, you'd have to get a sheriff candidate in who's willing to dissolve the whole thing. And I was like, until someone tells me they're willing to dissolve the whole thing, I'm not buying any of their ideas.
So actually, if I run for sheriff, instead of just running on it and saying, I want to run on breaking up the deputy gangs. I've never been in law enforcement in my life, but these deputy gangs are a real issue, and that we need to break them up, and that's what I'm running on, and I'll also try to keep crime down. What I should actually say is, I'm running for sheriff, and I want to dissolve the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and I want to eliminate it.
I think that'd be a good idea. I'm waiting for a sheriff, maybe not dissolve the whole thing, but I'm always waiting for sheriffs to say I'm going to downsize this department substantially.
Well, so it might be hard to run on that because, well, the odd thing is the public still has this default deference to law enforcement, right? If you say that to the public, as has been said many times, there's horribly corrupt deputy gangs rife in the department. It's basically an organized crime syndicate. Like that we need to get rid of. the public then turns the deputies. The deputies go, "Nah, we're good guys. We're trying to stop crime," and the public ends up voting for the people. Like because the public has this sort of built-in, deference. Is how much is that a problem when it comes to reform?
I think, look, I mean, people, just have a lot of deference to police. When police say we're the only thing that's going to stop crime, people tend to believe them. People need very little to believe police, right? Like they always are saying, well, you need us around to reduce crime. And then they commit crime. And then they still say you need us around to reduce crime, and they're still around, right? Like they commit some crimes, you're like, but you need us, and they're like, well, okay. I think one is that. Two is like, honestly, I think people think like, look, sheriffs arrest bad people and put them in jail. They are like, jails are full of bad people, and they are arresting them and putting them in jail, and I don't want to do that. I had one sheriff ask me something like, what do you want to do with people in jail? Do you want them in your house? And I said, well, maybe, like, I mean, I don't know. I was like, if they're a good cook, I mean, I don't know, like, who's maybe, like, I was like, what's that supposed to mean? Maybe they're fine. A lot of people in jail haven't been convicted yet. A lot of them are serving shorter sentences. A lot of them are genuinely sick, like they have trouble with substance use. They have health. I mean, a lot, these are vulnerable people. We just sent in guys with like steel toe boots and guns and sort of are like, go have in LA in particular. That's where deputies start. So they start in the jail and they tell them like, hey, this is where you're going to learn about bad guys. So they're like, you're learning about bad guys. And that's where they form their gangs because look, I don't think anyone joins a sheriff's office thinking they're going to work in the jail. I mean, that's like delivering people their mail and their laundry and like getting people their meds and like, it's like young men joining the office are not like, oh, I'm really excited to like go push the laundry cart. They want to go like drive their car around and shoot big guns or whatever. So, what they tell them is like, hey, we'll form a little gang and you beat some guys up. It'll be fun. And then that's how they move ahead, right? You have to sort of kiss up to who's there. And like I said, people who don't like it, they quit, which I don't blame them. It's a cruel and abusive system.
So the psychology is really interesting because it's almost as though you start as a corrections officer and then you graduate and you get to become the sort of cop who has the most impunity of anybody. Right. Like most corrections officers, they just got to go to the prison every day. But, if you go to the prison and you bust some heads like we tell you to, then you get bumped up to super cop, basically. Yep. That's very different than either normal corrections officers or normal police officers. And by the way, I'm with you that, look, there's a certain number of people in society who maybe need to be separated from the rest of society. There's folks out there who are difficult cases. But the majority of people in our jails and prisons are substance users, people who've committed crimes of poverty, people who are just got roughed up, and then literally just, again, people who are being persecuted by criminal law enforcement officers who are in gangs, right? And are just like having fun abusing people. I wish it were, people are probably listening to this thinking I am overstating it, but like, you can look up, there's a meme here in Los Angeles, Google LASD gangs, and you will find so much incredibly shocking information. There's a wonderful local reporter here named Cerise Castle who's done a bunch of work on it. You have as well. It's like difficult to overstate how deep this problem is and how acute it is. Is there anybody in a state who could step up and do something about this? What about like the governors of our states? Presumably might have some sort of power. I guess eventually the feds could get involved when it gets bad enough, right? That's what happened to Lee Baca.
Yeah, that's what happened to Lee Baca. So we have a few. I mean, the problem is, of course, like one, it's kind of insufficient because sometimes as a lawyer, I used to joke that, being an asshole is not a crime. So, being a political sheriff who goes on Tucker Carlson is not a crime. The DOJ can't prosecute for it. Can't prosecute you for it. In some places, the governor has some limited power. Some places have a recall, right? I know people were talking in California about some recalls. In California, actually, the attorney general technically has quite a lot of power. So the attorney general has open investigation. I mean, the problem is always one, an investigation comes after it already happened. So, like a bad thing
Mm,
happens, and then they investigate. And then, 8 years later, the investigation ends, and they're like,
sure.
here's what we're going to do. And nobody remembers this. I feel like
Yep.
people don't remember. Yeah, they're
Well,
probably
and a lot of times the penalty is monetary. It'll be, the victim will sue,
right.
and then they'll win some multi-million-dollar judgment against the sheriff's department, and they'll get the money. But then the sheriff's department, well, they're not the ones who has to pay the money. The taxpayers pay the money. And so you also have this problem where the sheriff's departments and the police departments end up draining the city budget to pay for all of the people that they're beating up. But it doesn't stop any of it. It just ends up being, all this money's flowing out the door to the victims of this brutality.
Right. I mean, they don't really suffer personally. They rarely even suffer politically, right? Nothing bad. If you retire, go off, like no one bothers you. I think the other thing about the lawsuits is, the people who are harmed have to come forward and sue. And that's in a lot of places. Like if you're in, rural Mississippi, that's hard. Like sheriffs and their deputies, they take advantage of people without a lot of power. I was thinking, even if
Mm-hmm.
you look at deputy gangs, on the street, the people they've killed, they're like 18-year-olds,
Yeah.
20-year-olds. They're like young teens, skateboarders. They're people without a lot of political power. And that's not, that's on purpose because they're kind of picking people who just don't have they don't know. It's hard to sue and it's hard to come forward. Like lots of places I've talked to, especially like women who've been sexually assaulted by law enforcement. It's very hard to come forward and say, I'm going to sue. A lot of times they have they've been arrested before. They have substance use issues. They're trying to get their kids back in custody. And they're like, well, if I sue this sheriff, one, I might lose and nothing will happen. And then what will happen? They're going to come after me in my house and it's going to cause all this trouble for me. And I just want to be left alone. Right? I just want to go drive my car and not be harassed and get my kids back and all this stuff. I mean, some places like Washington State is trying to do a system where you could submit like an anonymous complaint and then they go investigate. So the idea is like the state investigators bear the burden of looking into
Mm-hmm.
issues of abuse to prevent sort of the most vulnerable people from having to you put your life on line. A lot of people then end up, I've just seen they leave town, the sheriff gets reelected and they're like, who believes this woman? She's, she uses drugs. She has all these problems. They could point out to these people. They're like, look at this
Right.
woman has all these problems. Do you believe her or do you believe me? People elect the sheriff. And then he's like, cool. I feel like it's just extremely hard. Los Angeles is very fortunate in that they have you have a lot of advocates there, and like good
Mm-hmm.
advocates and good reporters. So people know, like,
Less every day, but we do have some good reporters still here.
yeah,
Yes.
like people know that there's gangs. Like a lot of places, people they know who live there, but people outside don't know.
Right.
They just, it's just all the people who live there every day have to kind of live their life and then deal with sheriff or law enforcement. And again, a lot of these sheriffs get reelected. Alex will believe it, the exception, like a one-hit wonder. But sheriffs serve longer terms than appointed police chiefs. I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
get those guys, some of these guys get elected like 10, 20, 40 years. I mean, and
Yeah.
then you have the ones where like their kids or relatives get elected. So it's like he's the sheriff
A
and then,
dynasty.
yeah, it's a literal king, like a little kingdom. There's one sheriff who I interviewed. He kept comparing himself to a knight. Like he's very chivalrous, right? He's chivalrous and like a
Uh-huh.
knight. And the
Uh-huh.
posse's like his knights, like they're going on a crusade, and then the
Yep.
so like it's like this night. You can understand like this feeling, like they have the feeling like, oh, it's this knightly dynasty I could like pass along to my,
Well, and I understand
fellows.
why an elected sheriff would, Villanueva didn't do this. He was just sort of like out and out a criminal in public. But, most sheriffs, I think, present the very respectable face. I'm, going to be deferential and I'm law enforcement and et cetera, because that presents a good face, over the corruption and the gangs and everything else to the rest of government. But it really does strike me that, like, as you say, here in LA, we do know about the gangs. It's pretty common knowledge. The newspapers will occasionally write, deputy gang exists and abused people. And I think there was a story where people there's some reporters found the tattoo artist who was doing the tattoos for the gangs. And he was like, yes, there are gangs and here's what the tattoo looked like and shit like that. People are aware of it. You have to imagine that every person at a high level of government, the mayor, the governor, the county executives, they all know, and yet no one can do anything about it. So it sounds like the problem is power, that the structure of the sheriff's department is such that the elected sheriff and the deputies that work under him or her are so powerful, just like nobody can do shit about it. Like everyone wants it to change, but everyone's sitting there going, I can't make this change by myself, right? So is that power a function of the structure of the office itself,
I think yes. I mean, and first I want to say there's like this natural deference to law enforcement. I call it the law enforcement baronial class, where like cops
Mm-hmm.
get goodies, which is like they could shoot people and it's fine. They can like steal stuff and it's fine. They speed. I mean, I know this is like a
Yep.
sort of underreported issue, but like cops drive just bonkers and speeding and hitting people, right? I mean, this is stuff that is like people are very concerned, about like traffic safety. I mean, it's very irresponsible to just sort of be like speeding around and hitting people. Um,
Yes.
that's just by aside from like bad behavior, right? That doesn't have like, to me,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem like it has a clear payoff in terms of like solving crime. Um, we like to think they're out like solving tough crimes, but they're just like hitting pedestrians. So there's that.
I mean, I actually asked someone I know in city government once. I was like, hey, when you watch on TV and there's like homicide detectives and they're out there
Yeah, they have a
solving
pad.
crimes? Yeah, with a pad, and they're going like, oh yeah, what happened here? Like on Law and Order. I was like,
Yeah.
is that real? Does that actually happen? Like at all? Like, are there or is it literally just people driving around hitting pedestrians and then locking up the closest person, right? I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but
Yeah.
like when you look at the gap between our mental image of the police and the reality, it could not be further apart. But please continue with your point.
So I think there's first that, right? And I agree with you that we want to think they're like studiously examining evidence or whatever, but there are some people that do that, but not as many as there are driving around. Um,
Right.
and the second thing is like the sheriff has a lot of power because he has the jail and the police, right? And so what happens is he kind of controls like input and then what happens to that input, if you think about it. And that's very rare among law enforcement. So the
Mm,
jail is, again, going back to this idea of fee for service, the jail is a big money maker, right? So they
mm,
get to lease cells to ICE for immigration detention. But more than that, you have to buy stuff for a jail. You have like construction, you have HVAC, you have, you know, clothing and laundry and food. And so all this stuff, and you have all the people in the jail, which sheriffs tend to use at many places as sort of like their own personal workforce. Like it is not unheard of for sheriffs to use people in the jail to like set up their election barbecue or hand
Jesus
out campaign
Christ.
flyers or fix the church roof, right? This is like
Jesus
the
Christ.
kind of stuff they do. And so that kind of power, like the contracts that you get to dole out in your jail, and then all the guns that you buy and all the cars that you buy. So you end up having just like in some places, the sheriff's office is like a major employer. It's like one of the biggest businesses. And so they use that as a way to keep the power, right? Because they'll say, oh, I'm going to give you this contract, or I'll give this place the contract. There was some sheriff in Arkansas who hired his friend, the local doctor, to be the doctor for the jail. He's like, he's my friend. I like him. He's cool. Here's this contract. You get paid to take care of these people in the jail. And he was giving the people in the jail ivermectin for COVID, but he was doing it without telling them. He's like, here's your vitamin. And it's, and eventually some people incarcerated in the jail, like, what are you giving me? Why is this so? But it was like his bud. He's like, oh, it's my bud. And he like gives me a discount, gives me like a 10% discount. Nothing happened to the sheriff. And the doctor kept his contract. They just told him to stop doing, to stop giving people ivermectin. But like, it kind of, like there is this, again, this also explains why, sheriffs are still like 90% white men.
Uh-huh.
And some of this is because of this sort of like historical patronage system, right? Like sheriffs get to pick who their second in command is, who might succeed them, right? They groom their successors, and then when their successors are groomed, they're like, oh, guess what, buddy? Like you get my best buddy here will take over. He's gonna run, and I endorse him. And so even if it's not like their literal son, it's still like they've groomed the people in the department to do things their way. And that is one of the reasons why it keeps the office like really, keeps things really consistent, right? Even just in terms of like demographics, right? Because they're like, well, I'm a white guy and I like other white guys, so I'm sure he's going to do a very good job. I will just promote these people.
Wow. And they're also spreading power and patronage around through all of this money that they control. They're literally using the inmates to help themselves get reelected, passing out campaign flyers. I mean, again, so sometimes I have, I think I had a guest on recently who said something along the lines of, hey, we're lucky to live in the United States. At least we don't have out and out like graft and bribery like they do in many countries where law enforcement will just, make you like grease their palm in order to, get something done. And I'm like, it seems like at least in sheriff's departments, we're pretty fucking close as a systemic source of corruption and abuse in our society. And so you argue, let's come back to this, for dissolving sheriff's offices as a institution. Is that right? Like, how do we handle this problem?
Look, I worked on the book and I thought a lot about different solutions. Like, I want to say, like, I wasn't like trying to be glib or just, it wasn't like an idea that I was like, oh, this is obviously I know best and this is what we should do. But in the course of working on the book and looking at these sheriffs and talking to people, whose loved ones had died, I just, and then thinking a lot about the history, like where sheriffs came from, what they did, right? Like genocide, militias to change, right? Like all these things they did. I just thought, why do we have this? I really was like, why do we have this? We have guys, and today, there was a sheriff who was like selling badges for money, like cash money in an envelope. Like here's like they are doing this stuff, and they are hurting, right? They're hurting people. Maybe I guess your defense of Tammany Hall might be like Tammany Hall protected their own. That was right. The Tammany Hall defense was like, I gave out cards, but also you all got like chicken on. Didn't they get like a chicken on Thanksgiving and a
and it was protecting the power of certain ethnic groups in the city and blah blah blah. They could have this whole self-justification. Sure.
Yeah. So not to say it's good, but to say at least they were giving people like meals. These sheriffs aren't even doing that. So I'm like, well, what's the justification? Like, who are they protecting other than really themselves? They're not protecting the people in the jail who seem like the most vulnerable people. But then when you look at the history, you see why. Like they are kind of like, as you said, like it is sort of like a lot of, like they see it as just like a warehouse of people that they kind of have to keep alive, maybe. And then that's it, right? Like they don't have to have anything to do with them ever again. Not that I think every single person who works there thinks that, but it is what it feels like. And so you just start to think like, why do we have these jails? Why are they allowed to warehouse people like this? Why do we have these guys who can commit so much graft, who seem not to care a whole lot about the people? Like Alex Villanueva, just to go back to his example, right? He'll say, oh, they elected me. I'm like, elected. Why do you care so little about the people you're
Right.
policing? Don't you care a
Right.
little? Like, people are saying they don't like it, or might be bad, and you're like, well, like, do they not count? Are they not people? Is that, I mean, it sort of feels like
Yeah.
that's what they're saying. Like, these aren't people. We're protecting our own.
Yeah.
And so it was very hard. Like, it was just very hard for me to feel like it was worth, like, why, what are we pretending? It was almost like, what are we pretending to do? We
Yeah.
pretending like this is going to work one day, and yeah, I guess that was like and genuinely too, like in terms of reform, I thought a lot about like the struggle people had to reform. Like, genuinely, people tried to reform. Like, in a lot of places, people tried to elect Black sheriffs. It would, like,
Right.
Black communities wanted Black sheriffs. They thought, oh, well, they'll protect us from like the Klan, which seems really reasonable. They're like, we're going to elect a sheriff who will protect us from crime,
Mm-hmm.
which is being committed by the old sheriff and his friends, and
Mm-hmm.
like, we'll prevent lynchings. Like, we could do this stuff. And the problem is, whenever a sheriff is elected who try to do different, it's like they encounter like 20 times the obstacles, right? Like, it's like like they're climbing the wall, and then the wall grows like 50 feet higher, and it's like,
Yeah.
just kidding, now you're gonna have to do like extra stuff. You can't
Because the
just.
problem is the system. It's not one person.
Right. The system is just set up such that it's like allergic to change, as you
Yeah.
point out, right? Like you start to change, and they're like, no, we can't do that. We're gonna have to figure something else out in some way, shape, or form, whether it's like the state legislates. A lot of sheriffs ran for office saying they wouldn't cooperate with ICE. Right. This happened
Uh-huh.
a lot after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And they did. Like, communities of immigrants put their, butts on the line, and they went out and they elected a sheriff who was not going to deport like their friends and family. And that was really, like, one thing I want to honor is, like, that was really important to them. Like, people worked really hard to do that.
Yeah.
People like lived and died to get better people elected. But then in North Carolina, for example, they are about to override the governor's veto to pass a state law that says, oh, all sheriffs have to cooperate with ICE. We're sorry. So, sheriffs are like, we're very important, et cetera. We do what we want. And then when someone wants to do something different, all the other sheriffs, this is the State Sheriffs Association, which they have a lot of power in all states. That's
Mm.
like all the sheriffs gang up and lobby. They're all
This is
like,
the
well, we
mega
don't,
gang.
yeah, they're like, we don't like these guys who said they're going to like not cooperate with ICE. We want to make them do it. And that California has one too. They have a state sheriff association. They go and they lobby, and they're like, you can't make us do stuff. Why? How can
Wow.
you make us do things in every state? And, because you elect a sheriff at every county, so a place like Texas, so Texas has like 250 counties, it has a lot of counties. Some of them have like 200 people in it. They're not, they're like
Mm-hmm.
cows, but they have a sheriff. And so when you get 250 sheriffs in a room with their hats, because it's Texas, and they lobby the legislature, people are like, whoa, like, all these sheriffs they're all opposing this law, and it must be bad. But they don't think about the fact that, like, most of those sheriffs are not representing like the major cities, right? So let's say there's
Yeah.
3 or 4 major cities, it's everybody else. And so sheriffs have this way, kind of like the Electoral College. It looks like
Right.
a lot of people love the sheriff and what the sheriff does, but it's not like the people. It's just like a
Yeah.
gang of sheriffs.
I mean, this really seems to be one of the areas where in the world around us, you're brought up being told that the world makes sense, that we have the systems that we do because it makes the most sense to have them. Just like you say, sheriffs are like, oh, we're around first and we have different duties and blah, 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 blah. And then when you actually learn the truth, oh, hold on a second. This is one of the most corrupt bodies in American politics, seems to serve no particular purpose. People talk about abolish the police. I don't know about abolish all the police. That's a different argument. But it does seem like we should abolish sheriff's departments. And based on your argument, right? And at the very least, have law enforcement under appointed control rather than the control of an elected official. That would seem to be a reasonable change to make, at least a discussion we should have. And yet we cannot even seem to begin to have that discussion because of the power of the office, because of the deference that the public pays to law enforcement, because of centuries of, American culture giving deference to law enforcement, because of these sort of mega gangs of state sheriff's associations that are able to lobby against any sort of change. It seems like the entrenched power of the office is just enormous. So is there any hope for change in these departments? Is there any glimmer on the horizon that you see?
So I do always want to not feel like I'm giving people only bad news.
Me too. Me too, Jessica.
I want to feel like I want people to have hope. And this is what I'll say. Like, when I looked at it, I was really inspired by community groups, just grassroots groups of people who worked really hard and did get change. So, like Joe Arpaio, did get voted out of office. He did get prosecuted. And that happened because Latino leaders and community members were like, we're not going to do it. They stood in front of the bus. They interviewed people about their experience. They kept track. They did work, like a bunch of, people on the ground did work and made it so uncomfortable. Right? You have to make the discomfort so high that you get change, right? Change isn't going to happen just because someone is wise and smart and going to do it. Because the thing is, the system does work. I guess one of the points I thought in the book, began to think as I wrote the book, was that the system is working exactly like it's supposed to. It is supposed to work that way. It just doesn't work for a whole lot of people.
It's working as it's supposed to, and the way it's supposed to work is bad.
Right.
It was designed to work poorly for the benefit of a few rather than the benefit of everybody, which is how we would prefer a system be designed. But it is not a broken system. It is designed to be this shitty. Yeah.
Yeah, but I believe in the power of people. The change won't come because electing a different sheriff is hard. People work really hard, but also the power of people just to make it uncomfortable. How do we make what the sheriff is doing so uncomfortable that they have to listen to us? Because I'll tell you what, right-wing militias call their sheriff and say hey, bro, we're going to go protest this. I heard some Black Lives Matters are protesting. We're going to go and we're going to bring our guns and we're going to stand around. Is that cool with you? And the sheriff is I guess, sometimes they're yeah, man, you're awesome. And sometimes they're I get, but they see them as their constituents. I feel people have to make the sheriff see you are their constituents and you're going to make it real hard unless they change.
And you have to give them a problem. So I really like this answer because it comes back to organizing, right? Because what are the sheriffs? What are the gangs? They're very well organized. They have power and they exert it. The public has power as well. And even if, you don't have a good person to vote for, even if the mayor or the governor is not going to stand up, average people can. And if we change the climate enough so that sheriffs feel it is politically necessary to act differently, then perhaps that would be the beginning of a change. The power that the public has to change its sentiment. It's a big job in this case because of that public deference and love of law enforcement. But it can happen if we keep raising the word about how corrupt sheriff's departments really are.
Yes, I think so. Look, like I said, the change didn't happen. Sometimes I think about the fact that, the civil rights movement desegregation of schools didn't happen until someone sent the military. They had to send the army, right? People lived and died because they wanted segregated schools so bad. So these things are hard. There is a fight. I guess that's one of the things I began to think was yeah, it is a fight. And
yes,
I believe that people can fight. I see brave people doing it and I believe they can, but I think they have to realize it's not sort of oh, I'm just going to vote for this better person. It's a fight.
Yep. Thank you for ending with that point. It is a fight. It will always be a fight. And a fight like that is always worth waging, even if we don't live to see the end of it. And so I thank you for coming on to tell us about it and for raising our awareness of this really serious issue. The book is called, if people want to learn more, The Highest Law in the Land. You can, of course, pick up a copy at our special bookshop, factuallypod.com/books. Where else can people find your work, Jessica?
So I have a Substack. It's sheriffs.substack.com. Pretty easy to find. That's the only sheriff Substack. Some sheriff's mad about that somewhere.
You got that URL. They're like, some sheriff's like, I wanted to have my own Substack. I want to be sheriffs.substack.com.
Sometimes I think about that. I was like, someone out there is real mad about it. Too late. And on social media, I'm Jess Pish, JESSPISH. So that's where people can generally find me.
Thank you so much for coming on, Jessica. It's been a thrill to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Jessica for coming on the show. If you want to support the show and all the amazing conversations we bring you every single week, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of the show ad-free. For $15 a month, I will read your name in the credits of the podcast and put it in the credits of every single one of my video monologues. This week, I want to thank Game Grumps. That's right, Game Grumps. Thank you so much for supporting the show. I'm a big fan of yours as well. We also have Paul McCollum, Rick J. Nash, Bertie Cote, GD Cilia, Howard and Kevin, Faith Mercan, Michael Lurer, Cam, Darren K, and Angeline Montoya. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover if you'd like to join them. Once again, if you want to come see me do stand-up comedy in Denver, Chicago, Providence, Rhode Island, bunch of other great cities, head to adamconover.net for all those tickets and tour dates. I want to thank my producers, Tony Wilson and Sam Roudman, everybody here at HeadGum for making the show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week on Factually, baby.
That was a HeadGum podcast.